He is a monster of impossible power, a creature from a dimension of nightmares. But what if the most terrifying thing about Vecna isn't his strength or the world he commands? What if it's the simple, chilling fact that he wasn't born a monster at all? He was made, forged in the fires of a lonely childhood, shaped by the cruelty of a world he couldn't understand, and given his crown by the very hero who tried to stop him. This is the story of the man inside the monster, the tale of how a sensitive, broken boy became the architect of the apocalypse. We gotta know before we start, what's one detail from the show you can't stop thinking about? Let it haunt the comments below. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a quiet house in a quiet town, where the first crack in the world wasn't in the ground, but in a little boy's soul. The story of Vecna begins not with lightning and shadow, but with the quiet hum of a car engine and the false promise of a fresh start. It was 1959, a time when America was desperately trying to convince itself of its own perfection, hiding its post-war scars behind picket fences and manicured lawns. The Creel family, Victor, a proud veteran haunted by a wartime sin, Virginia, his wife, clinging to the hope of a normal life, and their two children, Alice and Henry, were the perfect picture of this fragile dream. They moved to Hawkins, Indiana, into a grand, imposing house that they had inherited from a deceased uncle. For Virginia, the house was a symbol of prosperity, a new chapter. For Victor, it was a place to finally put the past behind him. But for their son, Henry, it was something else entirely. It was a tomb, a laboratory, a stage. From the moment he stepped inside, Henry felt a connection to the house, a sense of belonging he had never felt with people. He was a strange, solitary child, with a piercing intelligence and an unnerving stillness. He saw the world not as a place of wonder, but as a broken, chaotic system governed by meaningless rules and cruel hypocrisies. He watched the adults in his life, his parents included, go through the motions of happiness, their smiles like poorly fitted masks. He saw their lies, their fears, their petty cruelties, and he felt nothing but contempt. This wasn't just teenage angst. It was a profound and deeply rooted misanthropy, a philosophical rejection of humanity itself. While his sister Alice played with dolls, Henry found solace in the company of black widow spiders he discovered in a crawl space. He didn't just study them, he revered them. He saw in them a perfect, elegant order. They were predators, yes, but they were honest about it. They didn't pretend to be something they weren't. They brought balance to their ecosystem, culling the weak, imposing structure on chaos. In the Black Widows, Henry saw a reflection of his own burgeoning self-image, a necessary predator in a world of pests. It was in this house that Henry's abilities began to manifest in earnest. At first, it was small things. He found he could make the hands of the grandfather clock in the hall spin backwards, a silent rebellion against the tyranny of time that so obsessed his parents. He could cause lights to flicker. He could see things, moments from the past trapped in the walls of the house like insects in amber. He was a psychic sponge, absorbing the history and the secrets of his new home. He began to practice, to hone his power. He started with animals, squirrels, rabbits. He would reach out with his mind, not just to see through their eyes, but to command them, to stop their hearts, to feel the brief, terrible snap of a life extinguished. Each time he did it, he felt stronger, more in control. The power was a drug, and he was quickly becoming an addict. His family, meanwhile, was slowly disintegrating. Strange things began to happen in the house. Dead animals would appear on the lawn, lights would explode, whispers seemed to echo from empty rooms. Virginia, already fragile, began to believe the house was haunted by a demon. She sought help from the church, convinced an exorcism was the only answer. Victor, a man of stubborn pragmatism, refused to believe it. dismissing it all as faulty wiring and stress. He was too preoccupied with his own ghosts, the memory of a shelled house in France, where he had, under orders, killed a baby in its crib. This memory, this deep, unhealed wound, was something Henry could feel. He could taste his father's guilt, and it fascinated him. He began to turn his powers on his own family, not just as practice, but as a form of judgment. He curated nightmares for them, pulling their deepest fears to the surface. He made his mother see visions of a demonic baby, a twisted reflection of his father's sin. He made his father relive his wartime trauma over and over again. He was dissecting their minds, enjoying their terror, confirming his own belief that they were weak, broken creatures deserving of their suffering. Henry's motivation wasn't simple malice. In his own twisted worldview, he was a savior. He believed that humanity was a plague, a uniquely human pestilence, and that he had been born with the power to correct it, to restore balance, to become the ultimate predator. The world was a lie, and he was the only one brave enough to tell the truth, even if that truth was written in blood and fear. He was designing a new world, one with his own rules, his own order. And his family, the first humans to disappoint him so profoundly, would be its first casualties. He was not a boy lashing out, he was a god passing sentence. The quiet, creeping horror within the Creel house was destined to explode. It happened on a cool, ordinary evening, the kind of evening that makes a small town like Hawkins feel safe. The catalyst was Henry's mother, Virginia. Terrified by the escalating paranormal events and Henry's increasingly cold and distant behavior, she had made a call. She had reached out to a doctor, a man named Martin Brenner, at a nascent government program, believing her son was not just troubled, but sick, perhaps even the source of the demonic presence in their home. Henry, with his uncanny ability to sense the thoughts and secrets of those around him, knew what she had done. He heard the phone call. He felt her betrayal. In his mind, she had committed the ultimate sin. She had tried to cage the predator. She had tried to fix him, to make him conform to the broken world he despised. That was the final straw. His grand philosophical project of exposing the world's hypocrisy became a deeply personal vendetta. That night, dinner was a tense, silent affair. The air was thick with unspoken fear. From Victor Creel's perspective, it was just another night of his wife's escalating paranoia. He was tired, worn down by her talk of demons and his own buried guilt. He tried to tune it out, focusing on the music playing on the radio, a dreamy song by Ella Fitzgerald. He didn't see the unnerving stillness in his son, the cold, reptilian focus in his eyes. He didn't realize he was sitting at a table with his own executioner. From Henry's point of view, everything was clear, precise. This was not an act of rage, but of purpose. He was an artist, and this was his first masterpiece. He began with his mother. As the family sat at the table, he reached out with his mind, and the world began to bend to his will. The lights flickered violently, the radio distorted, the beautiful music twisting into a demonic groan. Virginia's eyes went wide with terror. She saw him, not the doctor's, not a demon, but her own son staring at her, his expression a mask of cold fury. He plunged her into a vision, forcing her to relive her deepest anxieties, her fears of failure as a wife and mother, before showing her the truth of his power. Her body began to levitate, her limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Victor could only watch in horrified disbelief as his wife was broken, her bones snapping like twigs, her eyes bleeding before she collapsed onto the floor, a mangled puppet whose strings had been cut. Next was his sister, Alice. She ran, screaming, trying to escape the nightmare that had just consumed their dining room. Henry pursued her, not with his feet, but with his mind. He was everywhere at once. He caught her in the hallway, her small body rising into the air, her terrified screams silenced as he performed the same brutal, systematic execution. He felt a detached sense of satisfaction. It was an extermination. He was cleansing the house of its weakness. Victor, in a state of pure, primal panic, grabbed Henry and ran for the door, trying to get his son to safety, still not comprehending that his son was the danger. But Henry had no intention of leaving. He had one more piece of his performance to complete. He allowed his father to get to the front door before he collapsed, pretending to be a victim, falling into a coma to complete his perfect crime. He framed his father. He made Victor the sole witness to an impossible event, a man who would be seen as a madman, a family annihilator. As Victor was dragged away by the police, screaming about a demon, Henry was taken to a hospital, the innocent, comatose son. The psychological fallout was immediate and absolute. Victor Creel was convicted of the murders of his wife and daughter and sent to a mental institution, forever tormented by the image of what he saw, his truth dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. The town of Hawkins had its new ghost story, the legend of the madman Victor Creel. But the true monster, the architect of it all, had vanished from the public eye. Henry Creel, the boy, was gone. In his place, a new entity was born, taken from his hospital bed by the very man his mother had called for help. Dr. Brenner had arrived, not to help a sick child, but to claim a remarkable specimen. The first major catalyst wasn't just a family murder, it was the birth of number one. After the calculated horror of the Creel murders, Henry's world shrank from a grand Gothic house to a sterile, rainbow-striped room. He awoke not in a hospital, but in the pristine, controlled environment of Hawkins National Laboratory. The man who had taken him there, Dr. Martin Brenner, saw him not as a boy to be healed, but as a phenomenon to be studied, controlled, and replicated. For Brenner, Henry was patient zero of his ambitious program, a living, breathing key to unlocking psychic warfare and a new frontier of human potential. He gave Henry a new name, Jozo 1, a designation that stripped him of his past and rebranded him as a scientific asset. The relationship that formed between Brenner and One was a twisted parody of a father-son bond. Brenner, whom the children were forced to call Papa, was a master manipulator. He used affection, praise, and a carefully constructed environment of routine and order to try and tame the immense power he had found. He saw One's abilities not as a product of a misanthropic worldview, but as a gift that needed to be understood and harnessed for the good of the country. He tried to instill a sense of purpose in One, a belief that his powers could be used for something greater. But Brenner fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his subject. He thought he was dealing with a powerful but malleable child. He was actually dealing with a messianic sociopath who had already tasted godhood. One played along. On the surface, he was the perfect student. He participated in Brenner's tests, pushing his telekinetic abilities, demonstrating his power to see across vast distances, to peer into the minds of others. He was Brenner's golden boy, the proof of concept for the entire program. But beneath this veneer of compliance, Henry's contempt for humanity, including Brenner, only deepened. He saw the lab for what it was, another broken system, another set of arbitrary rules designed by weak men to control what they feared. He saw Brenner's paternal act as a pathetic, transparent lie. He was a prisoner, a lab rat, and he spent every waking moment planning his escape and his revenge. As Brenner began to bring in other children, creating a new generation of psychic subjects numbered Wudu 2, 0, 3, and so on, One's role shifted. He was too powerful, too volatile to be trusted among them directly. So Brenner did something both ingenious and monumentally foolish. He suppressed one's powers with a device implanted in his neck, a tiny chip called soteria. This device dampened his abilities, making him manageable. He was then given a new job, a new identity within the lab. He became a friendly orderly. He was tasked with monitoring the other children, assisting in their lessons, being a gentle, guiding presence. It was the perfect cover. As the orderly, one could observe everything. He saw how Brenner pitted the children against each other, fostering a competitive and fearful environment. He watched them struggle with their powers, powers that were a pale imitation of his own. He saw their loneliness, their isolation, and he recognized a familiar pain. But he didn't feel sympathy. He saw an opportunity. He began to subtly manipulate them, especially the weaker ones. He would offer words of encouragement, give them tips on how to focus their powers, positioning himself as a secret friend, an ally against the demanding papa. He was a whisper in the dark, a promise of something more. His ultimate target, however, was the newest and most powerful of Brenner's subjects, a little girl named 11. In her, he saw a reflection of himself. She had immense, raw power, far greater than the other children. But she was also ostracized, bullied by the others for her strength. She was an outcast, just as he had been. He saw her not as a kindred spirit, but as the perfect tool. He began a long, patient game of manipulation. He earned her trust, presenting himself as the only one who truly understood her. He told her stories about the lab, about Papa, painting Brenner as a liar and a captor. He preyed on her desire for freedom, for a normal life. His faction wasn't a group of followers. His faction was an army of one with a single, unwitting pawn. His entire existence in the lab was a performance, a decade-long exercise in patience and rage, all leading to a single, explosive moment of liberation. The cold, sterile halls of Hawkins' lab were a pressure cooker, and on a day in 1979, Number One decided it was time to make it explode. The first major conflict of his life had been the murder of his family, an act of philosophical fury. This second conflict would be an act of liberation and annihilation, a definitive statement of his superiority. His plan hinged entirely on 11. He had spent months, perhaps years, cultivating their secret friendship, positioning himself as her confidant and protector. He saw the other children bullying her, and he used it, stoking her sense of injustice and isolation. He finally made his move after a particularly brutal training session, where 11, pushed too far, used her powers to grievously injure one of her tormentors. Brenner, instead of punishing the bullies, had her dragged away for solitary confinement. This was the moment one had been waiting for. He approached her later, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. He told her that Papa was afraid of her, that he would kill her, just as he had supposedly killed others. He fed her a story of lies mixed with just enough truth to be believable, painting himself as a fellow prisoner who had a plan for them to escape. His performance was masterful. He was calm, reassuring, a beacon of hope in her world of pain. He told her about the soteria chip in his neck, calling it a tracker, a poison that was slowly killing him. He told her that with her power she could remove it. He played on her empathy, her innate goodness. For 11, this was a moment of profound choice. She had been taught that Papa was her savior, that the lab was her home. But this kind, gentle orderly, the only person who had ever shown her genuine friendship, was telling her it was all a lie. She was a child, desperate for freedom and terrified of the world, and she chose to trust him. Using her telekinesis, She focused on the small of his neck, her face contorted with effort. The skin broke, and with a sickening squelch, the tiny soteria chip was ripped from his flesh and clattered to the floor. The moment it was out, the air in the room changed. The friendly, gentle orderly vanished. In his place stood Henry Creel, his power now completely untethered for the first time in years. The mask was off. He revealed the truth to the horrified 11. He was number one. And then he offered her a place at his side. "We can reshape the world," he said. "Remake it however we see fit." It was not an invitation. It was a demand. He expected her to join him, to see the truth of his vision. But 11, for all her pain and confusion, recoiled. She saw the madness in his eyes, the dark, nihilistic energy pouring off him. She refused. That refusal was his declaration of war. What followed was a massacre. One, now in full command of his godlike abilities, unleashed a storm of psychic fury. He moved through the lab like a phantom, a whisper of death. The guards who tried to stop him were crumpled like paper dolls, their bones snapping, their bodies thrown against the walls. He entered the rainbow room, where the other children, his former pupils, cowered in fear. They were no longer useful tools. They were just more examples of the human pestilence, weak imitations of his own power. He slaughtered them without hesitation, a methodical, brutal extermination. The scene was a tableau of absolute horror. The bright, childish colors of the room splattered with blood, the bodies of the children broken and twisted. 11, drawn by the psychic carnage, arrived to witness the final moments of the slaughter. The sight of her friend, her savior, standing amidst the bodies of her brothers and sisters, broke something inside her. She was terrified, but her fear was now eclipsed by a righteous, burning rage. The first true battle between them began. It was a duel of pure psychic will. He was more experienced, more ruthless, but she was powered by raw emotion, by love for the family she had just lost. He threw her around the room, taunting her, trying to break her spirit. But she fought back, tapping into a memory of her mother's love, a memory she didn't even fully understand. She unleashed a wave of power so immense it stunned even him. In that moment, she was his equal. With a final primal scream, she pinned him against the wall, her power a raging torrent. The force was so great that it didn't just hold him, it began to break reality itself. The wall behind him cracked, not like plaster, but like an eggshell, revealing a swirling red and black chaos beyond. She wasn't just pushing him, she was banishing him. He was pulled, screaming into the nascent, primordial rift, his body disintegrating as he went. The immediate aftermath was twofold and catastrophic. Henry Creel was gone, cast into an unformed dimension of pure chaos. And 11, the trauma of the event so overwhelming, collapsed. Her mind, to protect itself, buried the memory of one, of the massacre, of everything. She forgot her own crime, her own act of creation. The world was safe for now, but in her act of desperate self-defense, she hadn't destroyed her enemy. She had just given him a kingdom to rule. For what felt like an eternity, Henry Creel, the newly christened Vecna, was adrift in chaos. The dimension 11 had banished him to was not the structured, decaying Hawkins we would later come to know. It was a primordial soup of potential, a realm of raw, untamed energy, flashes of red lightning, and a landscape with no form or feature. It was a place unspoiled by mankind, just as he had always dreamed. But it was also a prison. He tumbled through this void, his body subjected to unimaginable forces. The red lightning, a form of pure dimensional energy, struck him again and again. It was agony. It burned away his skin, his hair, his humanity. It twisted his limbs, fused his flesh, and remade him from the outside in. The boy Henry Creel was incinerated, and from the ashes a new form emerged, a creature of burnt, vine-like flesh, one hand a claw of grotesque blades, his face a noseless mask of pure rage. He had become a monster in form as well as in spirit. This period, from his banishment in 1979 to the events of 1983, was his lost era. It was a time of solitude, adaptation, and psychological reinforcement. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone. There were no weak, hypocritical humans to judge. There were no rules to chafe against. There was only him and the endless, formless expanse. He became an explorer, a pioneer in this silent, dead world. He learned its strange physics, its ambient energies. He learned to survive. His initial terror and agony slowly gave way to a sense of profound purpose. This was not a punishment. It was a crucible. It had burned away the last lingering vestiges of his weakness, his human form. He was now pure, a being perfectly suited to his environment. His misanthropic philosophy, once the intellectual musings of a disturbed boy, now became the foundational law of his entire existence. He had been right all along. Humanity was a blight, and he was its opposite, its cure. He was the next step in evolution. His mind, however, was a prison of its own. He was trapped with his memories, the look of betrayal on his mother's face, the terrified screams of his sister, and most vividly, the face of the little girl who had done this to him. His hatred for 11 grew from a burning ember into a white, hot star. She had not just defeated him, she had seen his power and rejected his truth. She had chosen the weak, flawed world over his perfect, ordered vision. This he could not forgive. His desire for revenge became the central organizing principle of his new life, but he was powerless to act on it. He was a king with no kingdom, a god with no worshippers. He could feel the world he had left behind, a faint, tantalizing echo across the dimensional barrier, but he could not touch it. He was a ghost, haunting the wrong house. The solitude began to warp him further. He had always been a being of supreme control and order. Now he was in a realm of pure chaos, so he began to impose his will upon it. He learned that the very substance of this dimension, the floating particles, the swirling dust, could be manipulated by his psychic will. He began to practice, just as he had practiced with the clock in his childhood home. He started to give the formless world a form, his form. This was the rebuilding phase, not just for him, but for his new home. He was no longer just an inhabitant. He was becoming its architect. He was laying the foundation for his future war, turning his prison into a fortress, a staging ground. Every moment of his existence was dedicated to a single goal, breaking back into the world that had rejected him and burning it to the ground, starting with the little girl who had sent him here. The psychological study of Vecna during this time is one of supreme narcissism solidifying into a messianic complex. He was no longer just trying to prove a point. He believed he was a deity, and his return would be a righteous apocalypse. He was alone, but he was not lonely. He was patient. He was waiting. All he needed was a key, a crack in the wall between worlds, a single point of connection to begin his invasion. For 4 long years, Vecna honed his power in the chaotic void, a king in waiting. He was an artist without a canvas. Then, on the night of November the 6th, 1983, everything changed. In the cold, sterile basement of Hawkins' lab, a world away, the girl who had banished him, 11, was once again being used as a tool by Dr. Brenner. Submerged in a sensory deprivation tank, her psychic senses were pushed to their limits, sent out to spy on a Russian agent. But she strayed. Her psychic consciousness, drifting through the darkness, stumbled upon something else. A creature, tall and gaunt, with a head like a horrifying, blooming flower. A demogorgon. From Vecna's perspective, this moment was like a thunderclap in the silent dark. After 4 years of near-total sensory deprivation from his home dimension, he suddenly felt a psychic tremor. It was her. He recognized her psychic signature instantly, but it wasn't just her. She had formed a bridge, a tiny, fragile connection between his realm and hers. In her fear and panic, as she touched the demogorgon, 11 did something she couldn't comprehend. She tore open the first stable, albeit temporary, gate between the worlds. For Vecna, this was the moment he had been waiting for. It was a massive influx of psychic energy, a direct line into the world he had lost. And through that connection, he received a blueprint. He could see Hawkins, not just as a vague memory, but as it was in that exact moment. The streets, the buildings, the very air of the town flooded his consciousness. With the energy from 11's gate as his power source and the psychic snapshot as his guide, Vecna performed his greatest act of creation. He reached out with his will and began to shape the primordial chaos around him. He took the formless, featureless landscape of his dimension and molded it into a perfect, dark reflection of Hawkins, Indiana. The process was likely instantaneous, a wave of psychic terraforming that washed over his entire realm. Where there was once nothing, there was now a twisted, decaying version of Maple Street. The Hawkins Library stood, but its books were dust and rot. The Wheeler's house was there, a perfect replica but silent and dead. He had turned his prison into his palace. This is the critical clue, the smoking gun that was discovered years later by Nancy Wheeler. When she was pulled into this world in 1986, she fled to her room seeking a weapon. But everything was wrong. The guns she had recently stored were gone. Her diary was open to a page from November 6, 1983. The wallpaper was a pattern she hadn't had in years. It was a perfect, dusty photograph of her life on the exact day the first gate was opened. The dimension wasn't a parallel world that had always existed, it was a construct, frozen in time on the day of its creation. Vecna had built his upside down. With his new kingdom established, he began to populate it. He had created the stage. Now he needed the actors. The demogorgon that 11 had touched was likely one of the first creatures he had found or shaped from the raw material of the dimension. It was a simple predator, a hound. He sent it through the newly opened gate, his first scout, his first soldier, in a war that had just turned from cold to hot. The demogorgon was drawn to the town, to the life, and eventually to a small boy named Will Byers, who was unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The re-emergence of Vecna's threat was not a loud invasion, but a subtle, creeping infection. It manifested as a missing child, flickering lights, and a monster that seemed to come from nowhere. No one could comprehend the scale of what was happening. They thought they were dealing with a monster. They had no idea they were dealing with a king who had just finished building his armory. The Upside Down was his perfect hunting ground, a place where he knew every shadow, every corner, because he had laid every stone. The sensory details of this new world were all by his design, the constant floating spores like a world shedding its dead skin, the cold, blue, lifeless light, the thick, web-like growths that covered every surface, a tribute to the spiders he so admired. And over it all, a constant, silent storm of red lightning, a memory of the fire that had forged him. He was a god in his own dark creation, and he had just sent his first plague into the world of men. With the upside down sculpted into a dark mirror of Hawkins, Vecna began the next phase of his plan, establishing a new order. He was the undisputed king of his dimension, but a king needs an army. He was a general, but he needed soldiers who could cross the breach and wage war on his behalf. So he became a creator of life, a dark biologist. He began experimenting with the raw, chaotic life forms and particles that were native to his realm, twisting them with his psychic power into extensions of his own will. The Demogorgon was his first success, a relatively simple but effective bipedal predator. It was his infantry, but it was a blunt instrument. It acted on instinct, drawn to blood and sound. It was terrifying, but it lacked strategy. Vecna needed something more. He needed control. So he conceived of his masterwork, the hive mind. He didn't want an army of individuals. He wanted an army that was a single organism with him as its brain. He gathered the particles of the upside down, the same dust that floated in the air, and with his immense psychic power, he gave them form and consciousness. He sculpted them into a shape that was deeply meaningful to him, a shape from his own childhood idolatry, a colossal, spider-like entity that would blot out the sky. This was the birth of what the kids of Hawkins would later call the Mind Flayer. The Mind Flayer was not a separate being, not a bigger monster that Vecna served. It was Vecna. It was a psychic projection, a remote-controlled weapon of mass destruction, the ultimate expression of his desire for control. Its goal was to assimilate, to possess, to erase individuality, and bring all life under a single, unified consciousness, his consciousness. It was the physical manifestation of his philosophy. With the Mind Flayer as his central command unit, he could now control all the other life forms he created. The Demodogs, the smaller, quadrupedal pack hunters seen in Season 2, were not just a new species. They were an upgraded soldier, fully integrated into the hive mind. They saw what the Mind Flayer saw. They felt what it felt. When one was hurt, they all felt it. This was the new order, a perfectly efficient, perfectly loyal army with every single unit connected directly to the mind of its god. There were no internal conflicts in this army. There was no dissent, no betrayal, no fear. There was only the will of Vecna. The only conflict he faced was the dimensional barrier itself. He could send his creations through the gate, but his own influence, the signal of the hive mind, was weakened by the distance. He needed a more permanent and stable connection. He needed an anchor in the human world. He found one in Will Byers. When the Demogorgon had dragged Will into the Upside Down, it was a tactical opportunity. Vecna studied the boy. He saw his fear, his sensitivity, his connection to his friends. And when Joyce and Hopper rescued Will, Vecna didn't let him go empty-handed. He secretly infected him, planting a piece of the Mind Flayer, a piece of himself, deep within the boy's mind and body. Will became his spy, his beachhead. Through Will's eyes, Vecna could see and hear the human world. He learned about his enemies, about 11, about their strengths and weaknesses. He was gathering intelligence for his next major offensive. The establishment of this new order demonstrates a significant evolution in Vecna's strategy. He was no longer just a brute force killer. He was a master tactician, a grand strategist. He had moved from individual acts of terror to a long-term plan for planetary subjugation. The internal conflicts that arose were not within his army, but within the human resistance. His tactics were designed to sow discord and paranoia. When he possessed Will, he turned friend against friend. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin didn't know who to trust. Joyce had to watch her son become a monster before her eyes. Vecna's greatest weapon was not the claws of a demogorgon, but the psychological terror he could inflict by turning loved ones into puppets. He was breaking them down from the inside, proving his old thesis that their emotional bonds were their greatest weakness. He was ready for a full-scale invasion, with a perfectly obedient army and a spy at the very heart of the enemy camp. The events of 1983 and 1984, which the world knew as Seasons 1 and 2 of Hawkins' Nightmare, were, from Vecna's perspective, the first major campaigns in his long war. The initial breach created by 11 was a critical turning point, allowing him to establish his beachhead. The kidnapping of Will Byers by the Demogorgon was not a random act of a hungry monster. It was a calculated move. Vecna, through his creature, identified a target, a small, vulnerable human, and brought him back to the Upside Down. This was Phase 1, specimen acquisition. He kept Will alive, studying him, learning the biology and psychology of his enemy. But more importantly, he used Will's presence in the Upside Down as a lure, drawing more people towards the gate, testing the defenses of his target world. When Joyce and Hopper mounted their rescue mission, it was all part of his intelligence gathering. He saw their determination, their resourcefulness. He learned. The true offensive began after Will's return. The seed of the mind flayer that Vecna had planted in him began to grow. This was a war by proxy. Vecna himself was still trapped in his dimension, but he could now command a front-line soldier deep within enemy territory. He used Will's episodes, his flashes into the Upside Down, to further terrify and isolate him, making him more susceptible to control. The drawings Will compulsively created were not just a symptom of trauma, they were Vecna, mapping his expansion beneath Hawkins. The tunnels that the Demodogs were digging were a physical manifestation of the hive mind's growth, spreading like a cancer beneath the town, all orchestrated by Vecna through his human puppet. The goal was simple: to connect the Upside Down to Hawkins physically, to merge the realms, and to prepare for the arrival of the Mind Flayer itself. The party's discovery of the tunnels and their attempts to fight back were, for Vecna, like watching mice trying to disable a battleship with their teeth. He was toying with them. He used Will to lead them into traps, feeding them misinformation, turning Bob Newby's heroic sacrifice into just another casualty in his game. The conflict at the lab was a major escalation. He sent his Demodog army to wipe out the scientists, a mop-up operation to eliminate anyone who understood the nature of the gate. He was tying up loose ends, but then came the tactical failure, a critical turning point that he had not fully anticipated. The party figured out the nature of Will's possession. They realized that Will was the spy and that the hive mind had a weakness. A shared consciousness meant a shared vulnerability. By taking Will to an isolated, unknown location, Hopper's cabin, and overheating his body, they were able to force the piece of the Mind Flayer out of him. It was a painful, brutal exorcism, and for Vecna it was like having his primary surveillance camera ripped out. Simultaneously, 11, having reconnected with her power, did the unthinkable. She focused all her energy not on the creatures, but on the source, the massive gate beneath the lab. With a monumental display of psychic force, she sealed the rift, severing the connection between the two dimensions. From Vecna's point of view, this was a catastrophic defeat. The gate, his main bridge, was slammed shut. His connection to his Demodog army was instantly severed, and the creatures dropped dead. His spy was gone. His invasion was stopped cold. The psychological impact on Vecna must have been immense. It was the second time this girl, this child, had defeated him. The first time she had cast him into this hell. Now she had locked him inside it. His rage would have been unimaginable, but Vecna is a creature of immense patience and intellect. This failure was not an end, it was a lesson. His strategy of a slow, creeping invasion through a single, large gate was flawed. It had a single point of failure. He had underestimated his enemy's resilience and, most importantly, 11's power. As he sat in his dark, silent kingdom, cut off from the world once more, he began to formulate a new plan. A plan that didn't rely on one gate, but many. A plan that didn't just use a proxy for spying, but for building a physical body in the human world. He had lost the battle, but the war was far from over. He was adapting, evolving his strategy for the next, even more brutal assault. The year following the closing of the gate was a period of forced hibernation and meticulous planning for Vecna. He had been beaten back, his connection severed, but a tiny piece of him remained. The portion of the mind flayer that had been exorcised from Will Byers had not been destroyed. It was trapped in the human world, dormant, waiting. This remnant was his new seed. The fall and transformation of the mind flayer's physical form during the Battle of Starcourt Mall was the culmination of Vecna's second grand strategy, a plan born from the failure of his first. This time, he wouldn't rely on a single, vulnerable gate. He would build his own gate, and he would build himself a body. The plan began subtly. The dormant piece of the mind flayer, drawn to a power source, found its way to the old steel works where Russian scientists, in their own bumbling attempts to access the Upside Down, were blasting a new, unstable rift into existence. This new energy source awakened the fragment. It was Vecna's consciousness, rebooted. His first move was to find a host, not a spy like Will, but a true vessel. He started with rats, assimilating them, melting them down into biomass. Then he moved up the food chain to people. His primary target was Billy Hargrove. Billy was perfect. He was filled with rage, trauma, and a deep-seated resentment of the world, a faint echo of Henry Creel's own psychology. After possessing Billy, Vecna began his recruitment drive. He used Billy to capture dozens of Hawkins residents, the flayed, and bring them to the steel works. There, they were assimilated, their bodies melting down into a gruesome protoplasmic slurry. This was Vecna's new methodology. He was using the raw materials of the human world to construct a physical avatar for himself, a colossal monster of flesh and bone. This meat flayer was the transformation of his tactics, a move from a ghostly, psychic threat to a tangible, physical one. He was done being a puppet master from another dimension. He was going to walk the earth himself in a body of his own making. The entire conflict was a hunt, with his flayed army seeking one thing, 11. He knew she was the only one who could stop him. His goal was to find her, neutralize her, and then assimilate her into his new body, absorb her power, make it his own. The battle at the cabin, where the meat flayer attacked them directly, was a terrifying success from his perspective. He wounded 11, embedding a piece of his own flesh into her leg. This was a brilliant tactical move. The piece of him in her leg acted as a tracker, but it also poisoned her, draining her of her powers. He was systematically dismantling his greatest enemy. The final confrontation at Starcourt Mall was the climax of his plan. He had his monster. He had located his target. He had weakened her. He was on the brink of total victory. From his vantage point in the Upside Down, he was controlling this colossal creature, feeling its every move, seeing through its eyes. The resistance from the party was an annoyance, but manageable. He cornered them, his victory seemingly assured. But once again, he made a critical error. He underestimated the power of human connection. The fall of his avatar came not from a psychic blast, but from a memory. The party, using their knowledge of Billy's past, managed to reach the real Billy, the scared little boy trapped inside the monster. By reminding him of his mother, of a moment of pure love and happiness, they broke Vecna's psychic hold for a precious few seconds. In that moment of clarity, Billy chose to sacrifice himself, standing between the monster and 11. This sacrifice bought Joyce and Hopper the time they needed to do the one thing that could stop him: close the new gate the Russians had opened. As Joyce turned the keys, the energy source was cut off. Vecna's connection to his physical avatar was severed. The meat flayer collapsed, a mountain of dead, melted flesh. It was his second major defeat, and in some ways more devastating than the first. He had come so close. He had built a body, neutralized his enemy, and was moments away from a complete victory. To be undone by a memory, by an emotion like love, something he considered a pathetic weakness, would have been infuriating beyond measure. He had lost his physical form, his flayed army, and once again he was trapped, alone in the dark. This second failure forced a final, radical shift in his strategy. Proxies weren't enough. Physical avatars weren't enough. He had to act directly. He could no longer afford to let others fight his battles. If he wanted to break the world, he would have to do it with his own 2 hands. The era of the Mind Flayer was over. The era of Vecna had begun. After the fiery defeat at Starcourt Mall, Vecna was forced into his most significant evolution yet. His previous strategies, relying on proxies like the Demogorgon and avatars like the Mind Flayer, had proven vulnerable to the unpredictable variable of human emotion and 11's raw power. He had learned a hard lesson twice over. To guarantee victory, he could not delegate. He had to become the weapon himself. This led to the introduction of his most terrifying form of attack, a methodology so personal and cruel it made the physical horror of the meat flayer seem almost primitive. He introduced the Vecna's curse. This new antagonist, Vecna in his true form, was no longer hiding in the shadows of another dimension. He was now reaching across the veil directly, his mind becoming the battlefield. His new plan was elegant in its sadism and brilliant in its strategy. He realized that to break his enemies, he first had to break their minds. And to do that, he would use their own pain against them. His curse was a multi-stage psychic assassination. First, he would select his victims. He no longer chose targets at random. He chose teenagers who were already suffering, individuals carrying deep, unhealed trauma, guilt, or grief. Chrissy Cunningham was haunted by her mother's verbal abuse and a resulting eating disorder. Fred Benson was consumed by the guilt of a fatal car accident he had caused. Patrick McKinney carried the weight of his abusive father, and Max Mayfield was drowning in the guilt and sorrow over her brother Billy's death. These emotional wounds were like open doors, and Vecna simply walked through them. The second stage was the haunting. He would begin to subtly torture his victims, making them experience headaches, nightmares, and nosebleeds. He would manifest their trauma as vivid, waking hallucinations. Chrissy saw her mother as a grotesque, rotting figure. Fred was tormented by visions of the car crash. This psychological torment was designed to isolate them, to make them feel like they were losing their minds, pushing them away from their friends and family who couldn't understand what was happening. At the center of these hauntings was a new, terrifying symbol, a sinister grandfather clock, a direct link to his own origins in the Creel house. The clock was his signature, a harbinger of doom, its chimes counting down the final hours of his victims' lives. The final stage was the kill. Once a victim was sufficiently weakened and isolated, he would pull their consciousness into his own mental realm, the mind lair. This grotesque, red-tinted landscape, made of twisted roots and floating pieces of his own memories like the Creel house, was his inner sanctum. Here, he would finally reveal himself to his victim, a terrifying vine-covered monster, and as their physical body in the real world went into a trance, he would telekinetically levitate them, and with a final, brutal flourish, snap their limbs and gouge out their eyes, killing them in the most horrific way imaginable. But this was not just about murder. Each death served a greater purpose. As he explained to Nancy, each life he took created a new, small gate between the upside down and the human world. He was no longer trying to force open one big door. He was creating a series of psychic pinpricks in the fabric of reality. His ultimate goal was to create enough of these small gates that they would merge, creating a massive, unstoppable tear, a wound that would allow the full might of the Upside Down to pour into Hawkins, not as an invasion, but as a merger. This new Vecna was a far more intimate and terrifying antagonist. He was a serial killer who used your own memories as his weapon. He was a dream demon who made you an active participant in your own demise. His introduction changed the rules of the game entirely. The fight was no longer about finding a monster in the woods or blowing up a creature in a mall. It was about saving your friends from their own minds. It was a battle that couldn't be won with guns or bombs, but with empathy, connection, and, as the party discovered, the power of a really good song. The emergence of Vecna's curse marked the beginning of the second, and arguably most desperate, major conflict in the war for Hawkins. The fight was no longer against a shadowy organization or a faceless monster. It was a direct confrontation with the newly crowned king of the Upside Down himself. The battle unfolded on multiple fronts, a frantic race against time as the kids in Hawkins tried to unravel a mystery while their friends were being picked off one by one. The initial phase of the conflict was pure detective work. Dustin, Lucas, Max, Steve, Nancy, and Robin found themselves at the center of a supernatural murder mystery. They were the only ones who knew the gruesome death of Chrissy Cunningham wasn't the work of their friend, Eddie Munson, the leader of the Hellfire Club who was now the town's prime suspect. They had to prove Eddie's innocence while simultaneously trying to understand the nature of the new threat. Their investigation led them from the scene of the crime to the school counselor's office, where they discovered that all the victims shared a common thread: deep psychological trauma. This was their first major breakthrough. They weren't dealing with a random monster, but a predator that hunted the emotionally vulnerable. The stakes escalated dramatically when Max realized she was the next target. She started seeing the clock, hearing its chimes, and experiencing the same symptoms as Chrissy and Fred. Her life was now on a timer. This personal threat transformed the conflict from a theoretical problem into a desperate fight for survival. The party's strategy had to adapt. They couldn't physically fight a creature that existed in the mind. Their solution was ingenious, born from a mix of desperate research and a little bit of luck. By talking to Victor Creel, Nancy and Robin learned that music had been a key factor in his survival. A song had anchored him to reality, pulling him back from the brink of Vecna's curse. They theorized that a powerful, positive emotional connection, specifically to a favorite song, could act as a lifeline, a rope to pull someone out of the mind lair. This led to one of the most iconic moments of the series: Max levitating in the cemetery, moments from death being saved by Kate Bush's "Running Up That Hill." They had found a defense, a shield against Vecna's psychic sword. But a defense wasn't enough. They needed a weapon. The conflict shifted to a new goal: how to fight back. The party devised a multi-pronged plan. One group, led by Nancy, would try to find Vecna's physical body in the Upside Down, believing that while his mind was attacking his victims, his body must be vulnerable. This led them on a journey through the Watergate at Lover's Lake, a terrifying expedition into the heart of the enemy's kingdom. Meanwhile, 11, now in California, and powerless, embarked on her own desperate mission. Realizing she was the only one who could truly fight Vecna, she went with Dr. Owens to a secret facility to undergo the Nina Project, a dangerous process designed to force her to relive her traumatic memories of the lab massacre and, hopefully, restore her powers. This was a battle fought within her own mind, a parallel to the one Max was fighting. The second major conflict was defined by these split forces, all working towards the same goal. The stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about saving a friend anymore, it was about stopping Vecna before he could claim enough victims to enact his final, unknown plan. They were no longer just reacting to the monster of the week, they were actively hunting the king himself, taking the fight directly to his doorstep in a desperate gamble to end the war for good. The villain's new methodology required the heroes to evolve, to fight not just with strength, but with psychology, empathy, and memory. In the brutal calculus of Vecna's war, sacrifice was not a bug, it was a feature. He preyed on those willing to give everything for their friends. But the most devastating loss, the one that served as the final bloody key to his master plan, was the sacrifice and clinical death of Max Mayfield. It was a moment of profound heroism and heart-wrenching tragedy, a loss that was simultaneously a victory for Vecna. The final battle was a complex, multi-stage assault on Vecna, meticulously planned by the separated factions of the party. The plan, dubbed Phase 3, was to use Max as bait. She would willingly turn off her music, allowing Vecna to enter her mind. While she distracted him in the mind layer, the Hawkins crew, Steve, Nancy, and Robin, would sneak into the upside-down version of the Creel house and attack his vulnerable, entranced physical body with fire, his primary weakness. Meanwhile, in Russia, Hopper, Joyce, and Murray would fight the Demogorgon at the prison, believing that all creatures of the Upside Down were a hive mind and that damaging one would damage them all, including Vecna. And in the Nevada desert, 11 would use her newly restored powers to piggyback into Max's mind, fighting Vecna on his own psychic turf. It was a brilliant, desperate plan. And for a while it worked. The tension was almost unbearable. In the Upside Down, Eddie Munson, a hero to the very end, created the most metal concert ever, shredding Metallica's Master of Puppets on his guitar to draw the swarming Demobats away from the Creel house, buying Steve, Nancy, and Robin the time they needed. In Max's mind, she hid from Vecna in her happiest memory, the snowball dance. But Vecna was a master of his own domain. He twisted her happy memory into a nightmare of blood and balloons, cornering her. Just as he was about to strike, 11 appeared. The two titans clashed in a psychic duel, a rematch years in the making. But Vecna was too powerful in his own realm. He overpowered 11, binding her in vines, forcing her to watch as he proceeded with his plan. He told her his entire story, his grand vision, before turning back to Max. The true sacrifice came in this moment. Max, terrified but resolute, had chosen to face the darkness head-on to save her friends. Lucas, in the real world, fought desperately to protect her physical body from the jock Jason, who believed Max was part of a satanic ritual. As Vecna began his gruesome work, levitating Max, her bones began to snap. It was happening. He was winning. But then the tide seemed to turn. Mike's heartfelt confession of love reached 11, giving her the strength to break free and psychically blast Vecna away from Max. In the Upside Down, Steve and Robin, covered by Nancy's shotgun blasts, lit Vecna's physical body on fire. He burned, and for a moment it looked like they had won. But it was too late. Max collapsed into Lucas's arms. Her limbs were broken, her eyes were bleeding, and she was blind. "I can't see anything," she cried. "I'm not ready to die. I don't want to die." And then her heart stopped. She was gone. For one horrifying minute, Max Mayfield was clinically dead. And that was all Vecna needed. Her death was the fourth and final sacrifice. The grandfather clock chimed 4 times. In that instant, the 4 small gates he had created at the trailer park, on the road, at Lover's Lake, and now in the Creel house, erupted. Fiery red fissures of energy tore through Hawkins, converging on the center of town, creating a colossal bleeding wound in the fabric of reality. Vecna had been wounded, but he had won. Max's sacrifice, her devastating, heroic death, was not a defeat for him, but the final, triumphant note of his symphony of destruction. The immediate aftermath of Vecna's partial victory was a chaotic and heartbreaking tableau of loss and confusion. The ground in Hawkins had literally split open, swallowing homes and spewing fire. From Vecna's perspective, even as his physical body burned and he was forced to retreat, this was a moment of supreme triumph. He had achieved his primary objective. The psychological and emotional fallout for the heroes was immense, a bitter cocktail of grief, guilt, and terror. In the Creel house, Lucas cradled Max's broken, lifeless body, his screams of anguish echoing in the ruined attic. He had fought so hard to protect her, only to watch her die in his arms. His world had shattered. At the same time, in the void of the Nina project, 11, feeling Max's life extinguish, refused to accept it. In an unprecedented act of power and love, she placed her hand on Max's psychic echo and whispered, "No, you're not going." She poured her own energy, her own life force, into her friend, and miraculously, in the real world, Max's heart started beating again. But it was a hollow victory. 11 had restarted her heart, but her mind, the part of her that was truly Max, was gone. She was in a coma, her body broken, her consciousness lost somewhere in the void, perhaps even trapped by Vecna. For the rest of the party, the reunion was bittersweet and shadowed by doom. They returned to Hawkins not as victors, but as witnesses to the apocalypse. The sky was dark, filled with red lightning. A strange, snow-like ash, the spores of the Upside Down, was falling, coating the entire town in a blanket of dimensional decay. The line between their world and his was blurring. The emotional weight of what had happened was crushing. Dustin had to deliver the news of Eddie's death to his uncle, a gut-wrenching scene where he confessed that while the town would remember Eddie as a villain, he had died a hero, fighting for a town that hated him. The group's morale was at an all-time low. They had thrown everything they had at Vecna, and they had failed to stop his plan. Their best friend was in a hospital bed, a living ghost. Their other friend was dead, a martyr who would never be recognized. The town they had fought to protect for years was now a disaster zone, a wound on the face of the earth. The strategic fallout was just as dire. Vecna was wounded, yes, but he was alive. Will Byers, the original canary in the coal mine, could feel him. Standing in a field of dying flowers, the telltale goosebumps on his neck returned. "He's not dead," Will confirmed, his voice trembling. "He's hurt. He's hurting, but he's alive." This was the most terrifying revelation of all. Not only had their plan failed to stop the gates from opening, but it had also failed to kill the king. He was out there in the dying, transformed landscape of the Upside Down, healing, recovering, and preparing for the final phase of his war. The gates were open. The barrier was broken. The Upside Down was no longer another dimension. It was seeping into their reality, poisoning the land, killing the vegetation, and heralding the arrival of his full army. The fight was no longer about preventing an invasion, it was about surviving one that had already begun. The emotional fallout was a mix of grief for what they had lost and pure terror for what was to come. As the dust and spores settled on a broken Hawkins, the stage was set for the final desperate act. Vecna, though grievously injured from being simultaneously attacked on 3 fronts, was in a position of unprecedented power. From his throne in the decaying Creel house of the Upside Down, he could look out upon his masterpiece, the slow, inexorable consumption of a world he despised. This period was his final push, the preparation for the end. His first priority was to heal. The combined assault of Molotov cocktails and 11's psychic blast had left his physical form a charred, weakened mess. But the Upside Down itself was his life support. The vines that snaked through his lair would have reconnected to him, feeding him the dimension's dark energy, knitting his burnt flesh back together. His healing process would be a reflection of his will, patient, relentless, and fueled by pure hatred. While he recovered, his plan was already in motion. The massive rifts tearing through Hawkins were not just portals, they were conduits. They were actively terraforming the town, pumping the toxic atmosphere and corrupting flora of the Upside Down into the human world. The dying sunflowers, the darkening sky, these were the first symptoms of the world's sickness. Vecna was no longer trying to break in, he was simply letting the infection spread. His army, the demobats, the demodogs, and perhaps even more terrifying creatures we have yet to see, would be massing, preparing to pour through the rifts, not as a raiding party, but as an occupying force. On the hero's side, the preparation for the end was a somber, desperate affair. They were scattered and broken. Max's coma was a constant, painful reminder of their partial failure. She was their fallen soldier, and her empty hospital bed was a symbol of the immense cost of this war. The group would have to rally to pull themselves together one last time. This would be the rallying the troops moment, but without the triumphant speeches. It would be quiet talks in hospital waiting rooms and whispered strategy sessions in the back of makeshift relief shelters. The multi-part plan they would have to devise would be more audacious than any before it. They now knew Vecna's full story. They knew he was Henry Creel. They knew about his philosophy, his motivations, his weaknesses. This knowledge was their only real weapon. Their plan would have to address several critical problems at once. First, how to close the gates. A wound this large couldn't be sealed by 11 alone. Second, how to save Max. Her consciousness was trapped, and rescuing her might be the key to finding a weakness in Vecna's psychic defenses. Third, and most importantly, how to kill a being who was essentially a god in his own dimension. The plan would likely involve another multi-pronged assault, but this time the goal would be total annihilation. Perhaps they would need to find a way to sever Vecna's connection to the Upside Down itself, to cut him off from his power source. This could involve a journey deep into the heart of that dying world, a quest for some kind of central nexus or heart that powers the dimension, a heart that is likely intertwined with Vecna's own. The character talks before the storm would be heavier than ever. Steve and Nancy, their romantic tension now overshadowed by the looming apocalypse. Mike and Will, with Will's connection to the recovering Vecna, making him both an invaluable asset and a terrible liability. Dustin, now the sole keeper of Eddie's legacy, driven by a need to make his friend's sacrifice mean something. And Lucas, sitting by Max's bed, his life dedicated to the hope of bringing her back. At the center of it all would be 11, a warrior who now understood the full weight of her past. Her final confrontation with Vecna would not just be a fight to save the world, but a deeply personal reckoning. She created him, she banished him, and now she would have to be the one to destroy him. The final push was not just about loading shotguns and making Molotovs, it was about finding the will to fight when all hope seemed lost, and preparing to step into a dying world for one last battle. The final confrontation would be nothing short of a war for reality itself, a desperate, sprawling battle fought across two dying worlds simultaneously. This is the speculative climax, the moment all of Vecna's history and the hero's struggles have been leading to. It would not be one fight, but a symphony of conflicts, each one dependent on the others, narrated from the interweaving perspectives of every major character. The battlefield is a transformed Hawkins, now a hellscape of jagged canyons spewing red mist, with the Upside Down's flora strangling the life out of the familiar suburban streets. Vecna's army, a horde of demogorgons, demodogs, and winged demobats, pours through the rifts, a tide of screeching death. The party's plan is a final, desperate gambit. One team, led by Hopper and Joyce, armed with Russian weapons and whatever the military can provide, would be on the ground in Hawkins, leading the defense. Their job, to hold the line, to fight the army, to protect the civilians, and most importantly, to buy time. Their perspective is one of pure, visceral combat, the roar of gunfire, the shriek of monsters, the chaos of a town literally falling apart. A second team, likely Steve, Nancy, and Robin, would embark on the most dangerous mission, a direct assault into the heart of the Upside Down. Their goal is not to fight Vecna himself, but to sever his power source. Perhaps they've learned from some ancient text, or a revelation from a captured Dr. Brenner, that the Upside Down has a heart, a central nexus that anchors Vecna to that reality. Their journey is a terrifying trek through the dead, mirrored world, facing down its most ancient and powerful guardians. Their narrative is one of pure horror and suspense, every shadow a threat, every step taking them deeper into the enemy's soul. The third front is the psychic one, the most critical of all. In the material world, Lucas and Dustin stay with Max's comatose body, using her favorite song not just as a defense, but as a beacon. Their hope is that her consciousness is not gone, but merely lost. At the same time, 11, perhaps with the help of Will, acting as a psychic amplifier due to his connection to Vecna, would dive deep into the collective unconsciousness that links the two worlds. Her goal is twofold: find Max's lost mind and confront Vecna for the final time. This psychic battle would be an epic of unimaginable scale. We would see it from 11's perspective, a landscape of pure thought and memory. She would fight Vecna not with telekinesis, but with ideas, with emotions. She would force him to confront the scared little boy he once was, while he would tempt her with visions of a peaceful life, a world without pain, trying to break her resolve. Their fight would rage across twisted memories, the Rainbow Room, the Creel House, the Snowball. The climax of the entire war would hinge on the interconnectivity of these three fronts. As Steve's team reaches the heart of the Upside Down, perhaps a grotesque pulsating organ of vines and energy deep beneath the Creel House, and begins to attack it, Vecna's power in the psychic realm would flicker. He would be weakened, distracted. This is the moment 11 needs. But as he falters, his control over his army on the ground in Hawkins would also slip, causing the creatures to go into a berserk, uncontrolled frenzy, making Hopper's fight even more desperate. The turning point could be the reawakening of Max. Drawn by the beacon of her song and guided by 11, her consciousness could fight its way back, appearing in the psychic realm to aid 11. Her defiance, her refusal to stay broken, could be the emotional blow that truly wounds Vecna, as she represents the unbreakable human spirit he so despises. With Vecna reeling 11 would deliver the final psychic strike. Simultaneously, Steve's team would land the killing blow on the Dimension's heart. On the ground, as the Master's consciousness is extinguished, his army would collapse, not just dying, but perhaps disintegrating into dust, their connection to the hive mind permanently severed. The battle would end not with a single gunshot, but with a silent, cascading collapse across 3 separate realities. The moments immediately following Vecna's final, agonizing scream across the psychic plane would be defined by a profound, deafening silence. The chaos of battle would cease instantly. From Hopper and Joyce's perspective on the blood-soaked streets of Hawkins, the shrieking hordes of demogorgons and demobats would stiffen, shudder, and then dissolve into clouds of black and red dust, their bodies unable to exist without the consciousness that gave them form. The red, stormy sky would begin to clear, the angry lightning fading, allowing the pale, normal light of their own world to filter through for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The immediate result is a victory, but a victory witnessed in a graveyard. The town is in ruins, the rifts still scarring the earth like open wounds. In the Upside Down, the world itself would begin to unravel. As Steve, Nancy, and Robin watched the heart of the dimension wither and die, the landscape around them would start to disintegrate. The mirrored buildings would crumble into dust, the vine-like growths retracting and turning to ash. Their escape would be a frantic race against time, trying to get back through a closing gate as the very ground beneath their feet ceased to exist. They would tumble back into their own world just as the last vestiges of the Upside Down collapsed into nothingness, the portals sealing behind them forever with a gut-wrenching finality. In the hospital room, the most intimate resolution would unfold. As 11 withdraws from the psychic plane, exhausted but triumphant, Max's eyes would flutter open. The first thing she would see is Lucas, his face streaked with tears and dirt, never having left her side. Her return would be the single, most full symbol of their victory, a life reclaimed from the absolute brink of nothingness. The reunions would be fraught with the weight of everything that had happened. The ground teams would emerge from their hiding places, seeing friends and neighbors they thought they'd lost. The party would converge, one by one, at the hospital. Hopper and 11's reunion would be a quiet embrace, the acknowledgement of a war finally, truly over. The reunion of the entire party, Mike, Will, Lucas, Dustin, 11, Max, Steve, Nancy, Robin, Jonathan, would be a mosaic of relief, exhaustion, and unspoken grief. They had won, they had survived, but the cost was written on every face. There would be an immediate, raw accounting of their losses. The people of Hawkins who didn't survive the final onslaught, the friends and allies lost along the way, and, of course, the enduring memory of those like Bob Newby, Alexei, and Eddie Munson, whose sacrifices had paved the way for this final victory. The resolution isn't a triumphant celebration. It's the deep, shuddering breath after a near-death experience. They have won the war, but the scars, both on the landscape and on their souls, are fresh, deep, and bleeding. The immediate aftermath is not about cheering, it's about clinging to each other in the quiet dawn of a world they barely managed to save. The victory celebration, if it ever came, would be short-lived, quickly replaced by the dawning, horrifying realization of the true cost of their war. In the weeks and months following the final battle, the heroes would begin to unravel the tragic, permanent consequences of Vecna's campaign. The world was saved, but it was also irrevocably broken. The most visible cost would be the town of Hawkins itself. Though the Upside Down as a dimension was gone, the physical damage remained. The massive rifts had caused irreparable geological instability. The town would be declared a national disaster zone, a permanent quarantine area. The government, in a massive cover-up operation, would attribute it to a freak earthquake of unprecedented scale. The residents would be displaced, their homes gone, their community shattered forever. Hawkins, Indiana, would cease to exist, becoming a ghost town, a fenced-off monument to a secret war. The personal losses would be even more profound. Max, though awake, would not be the same. Her sight might never fully return, a permanent reminder of Vecna's touch. Her body would be a roadmap of broken bones that never healed quite right. But the deeper scar would be psychological. She had been to the void and back. She would carry a piece of that emptiness with her forever, struggling with a form of trauma no therapist could ever comprehend. Her recovery would be a quiet, central struggle for the group, a living symbol of the price of their victory. Will Byers would face his own unique, tragic aftermath. With Vecna and the Upside Down gone, his psychic connection, the curse that had defined his entire adolescence, would finally be severed. He would be free. But who is Will Byers without the goosebumps on his neck? His entire identity had been shaped by being the party's early warning system, the boy who was connected to the shadow. His journey would be one of quiet, difficult self-discovery, learning to live in a world where he was no longer special, no longer a victim, just a normal young man who had survived an impossible horror. The party itself would be vilified. Despite the government's earthquake story, conspiracy theories would run rampant. Cults might form around the events in Hawkins. The Hellfire Club, and by extension the party, would be blamed by fringe groups for the disaster, painted as a satanic cult that had brought about the town's destruction. They saved the world, but in the eyes of many, they would be the villains. They would have to live with the secret, unable to ever claim their victory or clear their names, especially Eddie's. The wider environmental and political consequences would be immense. What did the collapse of an entire dimension do to the laws of physics in our own? Strange, localized phenomena might begin to occur around the world. And the government, now fully aware of the reality of other dimensions and psychic powers, would undoubtedly ramp up its own secret programs, perhaps becoming a new, more insidious human threat in the future. The true cost, ultimately, was their innocence. They could never go back to being normal kids worried about D&D and high school dances. They were veterans of a cosmic war, old souls in young bodies, forever bonded by a trauma no one else could ever understand. They won, but in the process, they had to sacrifice the simple, normal lives they had been fighting so hard to protect. Years after the fall of Vecna and the erasure of Hawkins from the map, the world would have moved on, but for the survivors, the war would never truly be over. The long-term legacy of Henry Creel's rage would be etched into their very beings, a network of scars that defined the new status quo of their lives. They would be a family, forged in fire, but also a collection of ghosts, haunted by the world they had saved and the one they had lost. The party would have scattered, as friends often do, but their bond would be an unbreakable telepathic tether. Mike and 11 might have tried to build a normal life, but normalcy would always feel like a costume. 11, stripped of her primary purpose as a warrior, would face the immense challenge of finding her identity as just Jane. Her powers, no longer needed for combat, might feel like a vestige of a life she was desperate to leave behind, a constant reminder of the lab, of Papa, of everything she had endured. Her journey would be about learning to use her gifts for small, quiet acts of creation rather than destruction. Dustin, driven by a fierce need to honor Eddie's memory, would likely have pursued a career in science, perhaps becoming a brilliant but eccentric physicist, forever chasing the echoes of the forces he'd witnessed, trying to make sense of the impossible. He would be the keeper of their history, the one who ensured the truth. Their truth was never forgotten, even if it could never be told. Lucas, his life forever shaped by Max's brush with death, might have become a writer or a counselor, someone dedicated to understanding and helping people through trauma. His fierce loyalty and protective nature, once used to defend his friends from monsters, would be repurposed to help them navigate the quiet horrors of everyday life. Steve, Nancy, and Robin, the older guard, would carry the weight differently. Steve, the reluctant babysitter turned bona fide hero, would likely struggle to find a purpose as grand as the one he'd lost, forever feeling like his best days, his most important moments, were already behind him. Nancy, the investigative journalist, would be a force to be reckoned with, but she would be forever chasing stories that could never compare to the one she could never write. And Robin would use her brilliant mind and sharp wit as a shield, keeping the world at arm's length, finding solace only with the few people on Earth who knew her truth. The greatest legacy of Vecna's war would be the secret they all carried. They would live in a world that had no idea what they had done, no concept of the sacrifice they had made. This shared secret would be both a bond and a prison, isolating them from the rest of humanity. They were the silent guardians of a history that officially never happened. The world was safe because of them, but they could never be truly safe in it. The lasting scars were not just on their minds, but on the world itself. The quarantined zone of Hawkins would be a permanent physical reminder of the fragility of their reality, a place of pilgrimage for conspiracy theorists and a source of quiet dread for the few who knew what really happened there. Vecna was gone, but the knowledge he had imparted was permanent, that the world is not as solid as it seems, and that monsters are not only real, but they can be born from the quiet pain of a single human heart. The story of Vecna is a chilling odyssey, a journey from the quiet contempt of a lonely boy to the roaring apocalypse of a fallen god. He was a creature of profound order who saw the messy, beautiful chaos of humanity as a sickness to be cured. In his quest to impose his own perfect, silent structure on the world, he became the very chaos he sought to destroy, a monster born not of darkness, but of a twisted, obsessive love for his own brand of truth. The heroes who rose to fight him were not soldiers, they were friends, outcasts, and lovers, armed with D&D manuals, cassette tapes, and a fierce, unyielding loyalty that Vecna, in his supreme intelligence, could never comprehend. They proved that the greatest weapon against a monster who feeds on isolation is togetherness. They saved the world, but in doing so they had to join him in the shadows, becoming keepers of a terrible secret, their victory forever invisible to the world they protected. But as the dust settles on a war that can never be spoken of, and the heroes attempt to live in the quiet world they fought for, one question lingers in the silence. What happens when the world forgets the price of its own salvation, and a new, lonely child starts to see the cracks in its perfect facade?